Did you know that you can watch the Senate live on YouTube? Visit the channel by browsing to youtube.com/@ Senate of Virginia. That's youtube.com/@ Senate of Virginia. Senate Committee Room A305. This is the Senate of Virginia, Richmond, Virginia. This is the Senate of Virginia, Richmond, Virginia. Senate Committee Room A305. Did you know that you can watch the Senate live on YouTube? Visit the channel by browsing to youtube.com/@Senate of Virginia. That's youtube.com/@Senate of Virginia. Senate Committee Room A305. This is the Senate of Virginia, Richmond, Virginia. This is the Senate of Virginia, Richmond, Virginia. Senate Committee Room A305. Did you know that you can watch the Senate live on YouTube? Visit the channel by browsing to youtube.com/@Senate of Virginia. That's youtube.com/@Senate of Virginia. Senate Committee Room A305. This is the Senate of Virginia, Richmond, Virginia. This is the Senate of Virginia, Richmond, Virginia. Senate Committee Room A305. Did you know that you can watch the Senate live on YouTube? Visit the channel by browsing to youtube.com/@ Senate of Virginia. That's youtube.com/@ Senate of Virginia. Senate Committee Room, A305. This is the Senate of Virginia, Richmond, Virginia. This is the Senate of Virginia, Richmond, Virginia. Senate Committee Room, A305. Did you know that you can watch the Senate live on YouTube? Visit the channel by browsing to youtube.com/@Senate of Virginia. That's youtube.com/@Senate of Virginia. Senate Committee Room A305. This is the Senate of Virginia, Richmond, Virginia. This is the Senate of Virginia, Richmond, Virginia. Senate Committee Room A305. This is the Senate of Virginia, Richmond, Virginia. Senate Committee Room, A305.
That means that Martin Johnson needs to come sit down as Senator Stanley needs to come and sit.
And we have Carrie Coyne.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this first meeting of the full commission meeting of the Virginia Housing Commission. We're happy to have you here this afternoon, and I'd like to welcome everyone for joining us, and I'd like to go ahead and call our meeting to order. Do we need to call a roll?
We don't.
Okay. So I would like to have everyone who's here in person introduce themselves, and we have a couple of people who are online. So starting to my right with Martin Johnson.
Good afternoon. My name is Martin Johnson. I'm a commission member, currently work with the Virginia Association of Realtors.
Good afternoon, Delegate Adele McClure. I represent Arlington's 2nd House District.
Good afternoon, Ghazala Hashmi, representing the 15th Senatorial District, Richmond City and Chesterfield.
Good afternoon, David Bolivar, representing the 11th House District, City of Fairfax, parts of Fairfax County, George Mason University.
Mamie Locke, representing the 23rd Senate District, all of the City of Hampton, and part of the City of Newport News.
Elizabeth Pollen, Director of Virginia Housing Commission.
Good afternoon. Senator Locke's favorite Republican, Senator Bill Stanley, 7th Senate District. Still applies, right? Thank you.
Good afternoon. I am Delegate Brianna Sewell, and I proudly represent Prince William County's 25th District.
Hello, Ashley Welburn with Welburn Management, gubernatorial appointee.
And who do we have online? I know we have Delegate Coyner. We can't hear you.
Thank you,
Okay.
Madam Chair. I'm Delegate Carrie Coyner. I proudly represent the 75th House District, which is home to Chesterfield, Prince George, and the City of Hopewell.
Thank you, ma'am. And if our staff would introduce themselves, please.
Jessica Hoff, Policy and Research Analyst for the Commission. Molly Bowers, Assistant Policy and Researcher.
Thank you, ladies. We will go ahead and get into our agenda, first with an overview of the agenda from Elizabeth Pollen.
Good afternoon. I'm going to quickly give you a very brief overview of how housing and housing-related issues fared during the past General Assembly session, as well as some housing statistics to whet your appetite and serve as an amuse-bouche for the two knowledgeable and topical speakers that will speak to you all today. Henrico County Manager John Victolkis and his staff will update us and offer a best practice model for small lot development. Sonia Waddell, a longtime friend of the Commission and economist at the Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond, will give us an overview of economic conditions and housing in Virginia and throughout the United States. At the conclusion of their presentations, I'll distribute the proposed work plan for the interim and discuss some Commission-specific details. A public comment period will follow. There were approximately 150 housing-related bills introduced in this year's General Assembly session. 4 of those bills were incorporated into other bills. 70 did not pass the General Assembly, 8 were amended by the governor, 21 bills were vetoed, and 56 bills were signed into law. About 20 bills had reintroduced concepts from the 2024 legislative session. The bills endorsed by the Virginia Housing Commission are currently in the following posture. The eviction diversion courts are now a permanent feature of the Code of Virginia in Section 55.1-1260. The Virginia Residential Property Disclosure Act now has required disclosures for buyers to beware concerning aircraft noise in Section 55.1703. Required disclosures for buyers to beware as buyers to exercise necessary due diligence. And in Section 55.1-1236, early termination of rental agreements by victims of family abuse, sexual abuse, or other criminal sexual assault or stalking has been incorporated into Virginia law as well. In Chapter 15, counties, cities, and towns, as part of their discussions concerning their comprehensive plans, now may look at accessory dwelling units and tiny homes. The Urban Public-Private Partnership Redevelopment Fund, as well as the Housing Opportunity Tax Credit, were funded in the original passed budget, but the funding is dependent on tomorrow's votes. Here are a few facts to set the stage for today's speakers. Existing home sales last year totaled $4.06 million, the lowest on an annual basis since 1995, according to the National Association of Realtors. In 2024, there are $4.06 million of sales of residential homes. This is lower than average due to high mortgage rates and higher prices of homes for sale. The median home cost in the U.S. was $407,500. In Virginia, the median is now $403,500, a 4.9% increase just since last year. As of now, which seems like our new normal, half of the renters are paying more than 30% of their income for rent. That is about 43 million households in the United States. Nearly half of those households, more than 21 million, are severely cost burdened, that is, paying more than 50% of their income for housing. In nearly half of metro areas across the United States, buyers must make more than $100,000 a year to afford a median-priced home. Ouch. So today we'll learn more from Sonia Waddell and see a housing solution put into play by Henrico County. Welcome, John Victokas.
Thank you, Director Palin, members of the Housing Commission. I want to commend you on the work that you're doing. The statistics that you just cited, we know all too well in Henrico County. You know, we started an effort several years ago on affordable housing because of the fact that 1 in 3 of our residents can actually afford to live in our county. Our supply of new homes in Henrico, or available homes, is less than a month right now. We've come up with a number of solutions, and I also want to thank you for your work. Last year, we had a housing development known as Glenwood Farms that had fallen into disrepair. We spoke to you the last time that we were here. You were able to help us with some amendments to the maintenance code, and we were able to use our Economic Development Authority for the first time in the county's history to do some things for housing. We've also done some redevelopment of old retail. Think of Regency Square. If you're familiar with the area of Virginia Center Commons, you're seeing housing come up, and we're using our Economic Development Authority through mechanisms like tax increment financing. We're here today to talk to you about the newest concept that we have, which is the second smallest lot in the Commonwealth. I am told the smallest lot is in a town, I believe it's in Northern Virginia. But before I do that, we also, if you have not had the opportunity, last year announced a $60 million trust fund that is funded with cash. For the purpose of affordable housing, we're working with a 501c3 Partnership for Housing Affordability, and we are funding that trust fund through data center revenue that we are bringing into Henrico County. We have a 12-year pipeline, maybe 15. The board has set aside those revenues, and basically we are working with the development community to generate 150 sales a year of affordable units. We have units that were in the $425,000 range that are being marketed through this fund for $300,000. 100,000. We have some in Eastern Henrico that are below 200,000. Our aim is 150 a year. And if you would like an update on that at any point in time, we would love to come back and offer that for you. I know our time is limited. I have 3 of Henrico County's all-stars here with me. Jean Moore is our Assistant Director of Planning, and she's going to be doing the actual presentation. This small lot concept came out of planning, and actually a board retreat that we had last year with the board and members of the development community that really offered suggestions and said, why don't you think about this? We took that forward to the board and have amended the zoning ordinance. Carrie Trattina is our Chief of Staff, and Eric Lebo is our Director of Community Development. So without further ado, I'm going to ask Jean Moore to come forward and present this information to you. We are here to answer any questions that you have. And again, I thank you for the work that you all are doing. Jean.
Thank you, Mr. Vitokis. And thank you. It's really an honor to be here with you today. And I know with all the work that the Virginia Housing Commission does, I don't need to tell you of the challenges facing all localities in the housing arena. As mentioned, I work in Henrico County in the Planning Department, and I was asked to share with you some of the options available to develop single-family housing under Henrico's current zoning ordinance. Some of these were implemented in 2021 when Henrico reviewed and updated and adopted its new code in its entirety. And one was more recent, just due to the ever-changing market. We believe these code updates and exploring all the tools that are available to us can help increase homeownership and affordability. So first, to give you some context and just touch a little bit about the background of Henrico's growth, which predominantly began as a single-family bedroom community outside the city of Richmond, very typical development post-World War II. Then we saw a pretty rapid expansion with the development of Innsbrook as well as commercial development. And then we began to see a spike in multifamily in the late 70s and 80s. So you already see that set pattern in the western portion of the county. And that's really reflected in that top picture that you see. That single-family dwellings on a quarter-acre lot were about 2.3 units per acre. About 16,000 acres are developed in the county under that pattern because that's just what was available and what was popular. So until recently, Henrico had 12 single-family districts that allowed single-family homes that range from about 1/10 of an acre, or specifically 5,625 square feet, up to 1 acre. And the smallest, what we call the R5C, it's capped at 6 units per acre. Then in 2002, the board adopted the Urban Mixed-Use District, facilitating denser development as Rockets Landing, West Broad Village, and Libby Mill are examples of that. So with the majority of that West End being built out and land becoming scarce, of course, it becomes more expensive. And as it becomes more urbanized, it becomes more expensive. At the same time, we saw the market change, especially after the recession. We all remember that, I think, in 2006 era. And then also the demand for the type of housing change. People really wanted to downsize. They wanted smaller lots. They wanted less maintenance. So during that time, Henrico we like to be creative. So one common practice that allowed that smaller lot to meet that demand was allowing detached single-family in our multifamily district as condominiums. This allowed more home ownership, allowed a lot more flexibility for the developer in terms of setbacks, and by eliminating those lot lines and setback requirements and getting a little more density, some of that cost could be passed down to the buyer. So this helped provide some options, but often financing for these types of condominiums can be complex, and the condo fees can also be a barriers for all buyers in all stages of life. So as we move away from detached housing, there are other options to expand home ownerships, including duplexes, townhomes, and condominiums. As you see more recently, the stacked condominium is very popular in recent years. Those are typically the 2-over-2s, we call them, where you have 2-story condos over 2-story condos. These types have been very beneficial for areas, especially in close proximity to transportation and other services. Financing is also a little bit better for the condos just because they can be built in different phases based on the building structure. So we had all those options in place, but part of our zoning code update, we recognized a gap in that traditional single-family district. As I touched on a little bit earlier, so you had the smallest lot category was that R5A, the 5,625 feet on 50-foot minimum. Then if you wanted to do anything, the next smallest was a jump to our R3 district, jumping to 11,000 square feet, 80-foot wide lots, typical with that first picture you saw earlier in this presentation. So what we decided to do with this code update adopted in 2021, we brought back 3 single-family districts, the R3A, the R4A, the R4 and the R4A. And this filled that gap. This allows densities between 4.5 to almost 6 units per acre. And this range really kind of reflects older developments that you would see in Highland Springs and Sandstons and some area of Lakeside. These districts were essentially eliminated in 2000 when the demand and desire was for larger lots in that suburban development. So our hope is that bringing these districts back, it provides another tool of options for housing where other types might not be as compatible. Another thing that was adopted new is the allowance of accessory dwelling units. These are allowed under a conditional use permit in 10 of the single-family districts and the agricultural district, and by right in any planned development district. These units, as you know, can be very beneficial, particularly as a means to provide alternative options for loved ones, parents who are getting older, a lot of times for people who are not ready to enter that buying market yet, but they can save up and live in a single-family atmosphere. It can also assist with first-time ownership because renting those ADUs can supplement and help pay for that mortgage, which may not be accessible from before. As we know, ADUs have been a major topic in the General Assembly, and we do believe our process is working and been successful. We've had 20 approvals so far. So fast forward a little bit to 2025, here we are today, and even with these increased options, the reality is that homeownership is just elusive to many of us. In terms of single family, is there more that we can do? What is still missing? And that's the question that has been a major discussion with our board, and exploring more options was a directive during the retreat that the Board of Supervisors had in September. We started looking at other communities and how they're approaching this missing element in the market. We looked at communities in Georgia, North Carolina, and Texas, just to name a few. And those are the same kind of communities that are undergoing the same development pressures and affordability issues. We did look at their design requirements and factors that can assist with design flexibility to lower costs, but also features to ensure an attractive, safe, and quality development. In the end, we developed standards for a brand new zoning district, which we call the R5B, which was originally an idea that we discussed back when we were reviewing the plan. And the R5B was actually adopted by the Board of Supervisors this February of 2025. The R5B allows a minimum lot width of 3,000 square feet, almost half of what was our lowest before, with a minimum lot of 35 feet in width. The allowable density is 10 units per acre, and as Mr. Vitokis mentioned, is one of the smallest lot sizes allowed in Virginia and certainly in our region. This district provides some creative opportunities, especially for infill development or for several older platted subdivisions that had never been developed. However, due to its small size, we do consider some design guidelines, because just getting density, you also want to gain a sense of place and get features such as open space, street trees, and sidewalks that are very common in denser development. So these are some of the examples of smaller lot developments, which are not altogether terrible, but in a larger context or a larger development, may not be well received by the community or even future residents. Narrow lots accentuate any design feature, especially if the homes are repetitive, dominated by large garage doors and driveways, or just out of scale, as you see in the bottom right with adjacent homes. To offset these potential outcomes, the board also approved design guidelines for small lot development as an amendment to Henrico's 2026 comprehensive plan. These address standards for architectural design, streetscapes, location of parking, open space requirements, and other features. So design standards can help address these concerns, but we also know they can also increase cost to the ultimately to the buyer. So as you know, as listed here, there are several and multitude of factors that end up with a home cost. Narrow lots can also increase the development due to fire codes, requirements or commitments of design to the community. So during our rezoning process, because this is a new district, anything to be implemented would have to be rezoned at this stage. We need to really balance and trade as we negotiate affordability with these features and where it makes sense. In addition, there's a huge effort going on now to look at our current inventory of lots. So we're looking at where else could these small lots work where they're already platted. We were looking at old subdivisions platted in the 1900s, and at that time, that was before zoning. Some of these were platted to be 25 to 40-foot wide lots that more recently had to be combined in order to be developed, and there's a lot sitting there. And so far, we're still doing this process. We've identified 500 lots. So some of those, as you can see, may be encumbered by some environmental features. But others can be, others can be prioritized and considered for further improvements that may be needed, such as road widenings, the extension of utilities, or the installation of sidewalks. Maybe that's something the county could step in to assist in these established neighborhoods. We do anticipate more amendments may be needed to allow these narrow lots in these certain areas and to add additional flexibility. Recognizing small lots will occur in other areas of the county and requiring rezoning, we're also looking into opportunities for further guidance in the part of the comprehensive plan update, which is currently underway. And I hope that some of you may have heard of it or participated in some of our earlier public outreach, which we call Henrico Next. So certainly as part of that process, we'll be looking at more strategies for home affordability. So that was really a quick overview of some of our latest efforts and tools to expand home opportunities in our region by, one, creating wide range of lot zoning districts, identifying current inventory and looking at ways to remove development barriers, and also creating alternative housing opportunities such as the ADUs that were not available before. And finally, as mentioned, we go deep in our process of the comprehensive plan. Will undoubtedly include numerous strategies as well. So that is it in a nutshell. I appreciate you sharing time with me this afternoon, and I'd be happy to answer any questions you may have. Thank you.
Thank you for your presentation. Are there any questions? Delegate Bolivar.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for the presentation. It's nice to be able to see policy married with a picture so you can visualize what we're talking about. I wanted to go back to, I guess, your slide on that R5B general residence district, because I think you got at the major point of concern on there with the last bullet under challenges with respect to saying no guarantee that housing will be affordable. And that's always a challenge, right? So, whether somebody avails themselves of that zoning, how much does it ultimately cost, and what authority does a locality have with respect to making sure that it's affordable? I guess for you, I just wanted to kind of clarify in my own mind, because you mentioned that a lot of these things require rezonings. And so when you rezone to something like the R5B, Does your county board have the authority to say that it must be affordable, or is that an authority that you lack? So you could change it, you could rezone it, but then you're kind of relying on
Right.
the good faith of the developer, or can you actually put constraints in with respect to your zoning?
I think Henrico does a good job with its relationship with its development community, and Mr. Vitokis is coming up behind me too. But so basically, all the proffers and conditions are voluntary at this time. So we do work in partnership with it, and I think that Mr. Vitokis could speak to it as well as Mr. Lebo about their work ethics with efforts with the Land Community Trust is one avenue that we've been using, and certainly that can be part of the rezoning process offered. Did you have anything further?
I did. So we have another tool after the rezoning takes place. The $60 million that I noted is a 5-year plan. So we are working with developers and builders literally daily. And this type of product would obviously qualify. We're looking for buyers between 60% and 120% of AMI. The sweet spot is really between 80 and 120. And we are have developed a pipeline, are by the end of June, hope to hit 150 homes. So in this, let's say you have a 20-unit subdivision of R5B, we would look to have it somewhere between 15 and 20% of those lots to be affordable. We are not looking to just do affordable subdivisions, if you will, simply because we want the homes to look the same, and not for someone to point and say, oh, that's the affordable unit versus the market-based unit. But the discounts that we're getting are significant, and we're able to do this within our statutory authority by funneling dollars through a 501c3 that is basically working with the development community and buying down the cost of the property.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Delegate McClure.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for the presentation. Just wondering if your plan for small lot development includes support for mobile home subdivisions where residents can both own the home and the land it's on, and then if you're considering even smaller lots for a mobile home subdivision.
So we have not looked at mobile homes up until this point. We have very few mobile homes in Henrico, but the thought was by going as small as this that we could, and marrying it up with the Affordable Housing Trust Fund, that we could basically get to a level where folks can afford it. But no, we have not looked at mobile homes. Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much for your presentation and for being here today.
Thank you, Senator. Okay. Thank you all.
Okay, our next presentation will be on economic outlooks and housing status in Virginia from Sonia Waddell from the Federal Reserve Bank.
Thank you all so much for having me today. I think one of the most challenging things about talking about the economy right now is what to talk about. So I am going to provide an overview of the U.S. economy, talk a little bit about Virginia, and talk about some of the risks that we see on the horizon. Also happy to take any questions at any time. Of course, my views are mine and not the views of the Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond or the Federal Reserve System. Actually, my biggest fear of doing any sort of an economic outlook presentation is that you walk away knowing exactly what you came in knowing. And I think this slide might reflect that, right? So the real economy, I'm going to talk about GDP, I'm going to talk about inflation, the labor market. For the most part, the numbers that we have, which are through last quarter, so through the fourth quarter of 2024 and January and February of this year are pretty good, right? So show some solid growth in the US, and that's true for Virginia as well. I think some of the challenges that we're seeing are in some of the sentiment indexes. I'm going to talk about the CFO survey that we run out of the Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond with the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta and Duke's Fuqua School. And some of the other consumer sentiment indexes just show some uncertainty among consumers and businesses. And of course, here in Virginia, one of the risks on the horizon is certainly the impact of changes to federal spending and workforce. So this is the broadest measure of economic activity that we have at the national level, gross domestic product. The red dots are the expectations or the forecasts of the median Federal Open Market Committee member for where GDP growth will be at the end of each of those years. So first, if we look at the bars, you can see some pretty solid growth. If you look at 2023 and 2024, a lot of people were expecting to see, if not a recession, then some very low growth numbers. We didn't see that. We ended last year with 2.5% growth. We had 2.3% in the last quarter. And the expectations for this year are lower, but are still, so the Federal Open Market Committee median projection was about 1.7%. Most of the forecasts that I've seen for this year are somewhere between 1% and 2%, depending on who's doing it. If anyone has looked at the Atlanta Fed's GDP Now forecast, I'm happy to talk about that as well. But for the most part, they're somewhere around 1 to 1.6%, 1.7%. And the FOMC participant, that median expectation is 1.7%. It's down from the expectation in December, so they made these predictions in March, but nonetheless is around 1.7%. Now, we have some January and February data on spending. So a lot of the strength that we saw in the U.S. economy and in this GDP number came from consumer spending. So that's about 2/3 of this number. If you look at retail sales in January, they dipped. A lot of that, is sort of attributed to, or I should say growth dipped. It's attributed to weather. And in fact, we run, as I mentioned one already, but we run surveys out of the Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond, and we got a lot of comments about weather in January, sort of impacting anything from housing construction to retail, so that could explain some of that. We also saw a softer number in February than was anticipated. So one of the pieces of that is kind of slower growth or declines in sales at food service stores and motor vehicle dealers. So, for auto sales, maybe some decline was expected and could have been exacerbated by some of January's weather. But the decline in food service sales is something that we certainly will be paying attention to. Nonetheless, there was nothing in the February retail sales report that indicated, some real slowing in the U.S. economy. And employment growth continues. So the bars here are the average monthly employment growth for the quarter. We added 151,000 jobs as a nation in February, 125,000 in January. All of these numbers are good enough or high enough to keep up with the growth in the working age population. You can see from this chart, though, we've seen some slowdown from 2022, 2023. And I think that normalization is consistent with other labor market indicators that we can look at, like job postings or quits rates. So this was the February jobs report was a solid report. Doesn't really change the narrative of a normalizing labor market for the U.S. Now, some of this depends on where you are. So this is employment index to 100 in February of 2020. And this, for those of you who don't know, is the 5th Federal Reserve District. So we cover North Carolina, South Carolina, Virginia, almost all of West Virginia, Maryland, and the District of Columbia. So the two top lines there, that's North Carolina and South Carolina. They've seen some pretty incredible growth, really since the end of the Great Recession, starting in about 2010. You have Virginia and the U.S. are in the middle, and then you have Maryland and West Virginia and the District of Columbia. D.C. has not recovered the employment losses. So index to 100, so if you get above that horizontal line, you've regained the losses of the COVID recession, and District of Columbia has not even before the last few weeks, has not come back to the employment levels that they were were at. I'm sure many of you saw the state employment report that came out. If you look, you can kind of see that in this chart too. If you look at the trend for Virginia, employment growth was tracking pretty well, pretty strong in 2024. It slowed a little in 2025 in February. Particularly, we saw a decline in professional business services and accommodation and food services. Again, not dramatic, but maybe something to watch as we go forward. So this is the personal consumption expenditure price index. I think the first presentation that I did to this commission was sometime in 2009. It was a very interesting time for housing then as well. And at some point then I took out actually the inflation measures because they weren't all that interesting to look at, but they have been very interesting to look at in the last few years. So I thought I would include that. So we have made progress on getting inflation back to that 2% target. That's that horizontal line. The February PCE came in above expectations. This is one of two inflation measures that we look at, but this is the one that our policymakers use, so I decided to include this. The red dotted line is the headline inflation, so that's all goods, and the blue line is core, so it strips out food and energy. So this number came in above expectations, with core inflation creeping up very slightly to 2.8% year over year, and headline is at about 2.5%. Again, the goal is 2%. And I'm gonna talk in a minute about sort of some of the components of this inflation. But I should point out that some of the measures of inflation expectations have come up a little bit, and some piece of that seems to be connected to the concerns about tariffs. And you can see some of that here, right? So this is that 2.8% broken down into housing, core goods, and core services without housing. So if you start with that red line, that's core goods, so it strips out energy. This is, again, here the horizontal line is at 0. So sorry about that. Again, the Federal Open Market Committee goal is 2%. But you can see the trajectory of the last few years in this chart, right? So you can see the increase in core goods inflation. You can see core services come after that. And then you can see housing inflation come up. Again, this is a year over year percent change. This is not a level. So we have seen, because this is the Housing Commission, I want to point out the housing one first. We have seen housing inflation come down. Although, and I'm going to talk a little bit about affordability, although I'm only going to talk about the challenges with affordability. We've seen the presentation on potential solutions to the affordability challenge. So I'm going to talk about that. But I want to point out that some of the market rent indicators that move before the housing services component of PCE have come down. So the expectation is that, or continue to come down. So the expectation is that in the short term, we do see this housing contribution to PCE come down. The last mile that we were talking about last year is really this core services without housing. So we just have not seen that core services inflation come back to 2%. But more recently, we've actually seen an uptick in the core goods inflation. So there are policies out there that could affect inflation in 2025 specifically. So tariffs is one, and I'm going to talk about what some of our CFOs and businesses have said or talked about with respect to tariffs. But that's one. There are other geopolitical realities that might encourage manufacturing firms to bring manufacturing back onshore. I've heard reshoring, onshoring, friendshoring. That's a long process, but it's been a hard 5 years, I think, for supply chains. And then the other headwind to getting inflation back to the 2% target that I see is wages. In a world where over the long term labor demand is above labor supply, and we don't see population growth, and we've been sort of relying on immigration in the last few months, particularly even a few years, to provide us the labor supply. And so, kind of trying to bring wages back down to a growth rate that's consistent with 2% inflation is another headwind. But on the whole, we have seen inflation continue to come down. And again, in the short term, we might get some downward pressure or movement from the housing space. But in the long run, we are still, even with the uptick in inventories that we've seen, so this is inventories of housing units for sale, we still have inventories that are consistent with about the 1980s nationally, which you can see from this chart. So, the median selling price, I think was, Director Palin mentioned this earlier, maybe 3.5% or so higher in February than a year earlier. Existing home sales have picked up a bit, but they're still sort of lower than they've been in the past. We have seen also some pickup in housing starts and permits. So the horizontal lines here are the averages from the 1990s. So you might think that we don't want to get back to the construction activity that we saw in 2005 or 2006, but you might think that the 1990s are a reasonable benchmark. We didn't get back up to that kind of construction in the U.S. Until 2020. And now, we've seen some improvement again recently. Housing starts, went up by 11% in February. Single family permits haven't changed recently, but they seem to be coming back. They seem to be coming back in the second half of last year, although they've maybe flattened a little bit now. Housing completions are slowly adding to the housing stock. But single family construction has flattened somewhat. And so we might not want to expect that naturally that inventory level to pick up. Of course, where you are regionally matters a lot. And we've noticed that one of the things that we do at the Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond is we send people out on the ground. We have people talking to business executives and nonprofits throughout the 5th Federal Reserve District. And this challenge with housing has been heard everywhere. So we've spent a lot of time in our rural communities actually in the last few years. And they've been talking about challenges with housing affordability more than they had been in the past. But that's also spurred some innovation. And so we've seen some sort of innovative solutions coming out of communities. So I think that there are opportunities there. Multifamily construction also seems to be picking up a little bit after hitting bottom in mid-2024. You can see that here. We saw that jump. And again, this is all U.S. numbers. But in Virginia, we have seen housing permits grow at about the rate of the U.S. So we've more or less moved with the U.S. In permits and in what we can see in starts as well. And I'm sure the Virginia Association of Realtors is following that data very carefully. The other thing I will point out, and I will talk a minute about housing affordability. So the Federal Housing Finance Agency House Price Index, one measure of house prices that we can look at. So house price growth in Virginia peaked at about 18% year over year in the second quarter of 2022. This is below, I'm sorry that this chart does not go back to 2005. We should have had it go back to 2005, but this is below the 21% peak that we saw in 2005. But it's still historically very high. And actually for the US, it's higher than it was in 2005. And, like we heard earlier, according to the Virginia Association of Realtors, the February median sales prices in Virginia was $403,000, which was about a 5% increase from a year ago. So we're still, seeing house prices come up, but not in the way that they were. So what does that mean? That means that we have seen housing become less affordable in the U.S. And in many of our communities over the last 3 years. So this is a measure that's put out by the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta. So what they do is they take the median priced home, they figure out what it costs to own that home, making assumptions about down payment. I think they use a 6% down payment, which is the national average. Therefore, they have PMI as well. well. They use the going mortgage rate, and they figure out what percentage of median income do you need to afford that median priced home. And the measure that a lot of people use and for affordability is 30%. We can have a conversation about that. But now it was sort of around 30% of median income to own the median priced home, and that's gone up, to more between 40 and 50% of median income. Now, the other thing that we can look at and that the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta does is pull these out sort of regionally, so you can look at the major metro areas. I'm not going to talk about this chart for very long, but I wanted to keep it in here to point out that we can actually look at Northern Virginia, we can look at Hampton Roads, we can look at Roanoke, so you can look at most metro areas in Virginia, and you can break them out by county and look at affordability. I will say the story is kind of the same everywhere, which is that sometime in 2022, I think it's like the spring of 2022, affordability went from blue here to orange. And although we saw median household incomes increase, it's just that we saw median house prices increase more in most of our communities. Okay, so I wanted to, so the overall story that I've told so far is, yes, housing is a challenge in many of our communities. Maybe we are not increasing the inventory in a way that we had been in past decades. But on the whole, we've seen this economy that's kind of growing. We've seen consumer spending. We've seen, labor market growth, albeit maybe normalization from a very, very, very tight labor market. But on the whole, the economy has been doing fine. I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the other things that we're looking at. So one, this came out last week. It is a survey of financial leaders of firms, somewhere between 400 and 500 firms across the U.S. This is done again by us in concert with the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta and Duke University. So that the blue line there is optimism about the U.S. economy. So we asked them to rate their optimism on the overall U.S. economy from 0 to 100. The red line is us asking them to rate their optimism on financial prospects for their firm. You can see we saw a jump in optimism in the fourth quarter of last year. A lot of that was due to the election, and we know that because we did a pre and post election. We did a couple of sort of randomized control trials on our participants, and we told them so in the questions. Maybe we told them ex post, but. So a lot of that was due to the election, and then we saw this drop in the first quarter of this year in optimism about the overall U.S. economy. We did see a fall. We saw an increase and a fall in optimism about own firm prospects as well, which you can see here. I will say that index just does not move as much. It tends to be above, as you can see, optimism about the economy, and does not have the same volatility as optimism about the U.S. economy does. And I take that to mean, people read the newspaper maybe more than we should. Anyway, so the other thing I want to point out is we also asked them to assign probabilities to GDP growth over the next 4 quarters, and expectations fell there, and you had a lot more respondents expecting growth between 0 and 1.5%, and fewer that were expecting growth above 1.5%. We also asked them what are their most pressing concerns. And so this is the share of total mentions. We can also look at the share of firms. Trade and tariffs jumped up as a concern to the top of the list. Inflation also went up. Uncertainty made it into the top 5 for the first time in a long time. Political climate, election didn't go down that much as we might have expected given that the election was over, and remained at number 6. We also found, similar to the election question, and we found that the more that firms reported being concerned about tariffs, or the more they trade with the countries on which we had seen sort of tariff news come out the most, which was Canada, China, and Mexico. So the more concerned they were, the more they traded with those countries, the worse their optimism and expectations were actually across a number of dimensions, including their own firm expectations. Now, I want to point out that a lot of this has to be somewhat speculative because the survey period was February 19th to March 7th. And if you remember, March 4th was the first set of tariffs, if I'm remembering correctly, that came out, and please take some margin of error in my memory of dates. Okay, so we've also seen a drop in consumer sentiment. This is the Michigan consumer sentiment is the blue line on the bottom. The red line is the confidence from the conference board. Like I said, there's also concern about inflation expectations. Now, I want to point out that if you look at, say, the Michigan Consumer Sentiment Index, it fell quite a bit in 2022 and 2023. So, that could have been a lot of that was attributed to sort of challenges affording groceries and sort of a result of the inflation that we saw in 2021 particularly. But it doesn't necessarily move with other economic activity. Okay, so the last thing that I thought I should at least touch on, since we are in Virginia, is the potential impact from federal spending and employment changes. So I know that Bob McNabb over at ODU has been doing some work. I know that right here, you all have been doing some work to try to understand what the implications could be. And I will not pretend to be an expert on this topic, but we did look at that top graph there is OPM data on employment. So that's place of work, right? And so if you look at federal government by place of work, by agency, you can see that Virginia has a lot of sort of defense-related employment, which you all know. So Navy, Defense Department, Army, Veterans Affairs, those are big. They have big presence in Virginia. If you look at Maryland, you get a little more HHS, you get a little more commerce, because of some of the agencies that are headquartered in Maryland. But so I wanted to point that out. Then if you look at the bottom two charts, so the one on the left, so this is by place of residence, right? So the one on the left is the number of civilian workers age 16 plus employed by the federal government. And you can see, we see Fairfax, we see Arlington County, we see Prince William County. But we also have some smaller counties that have a large share of their workforce in working for the federal government. If you can guess what the county with the largest share of federal government employment is, it's Los Alamos, not the largest county in the U.S. So some of the counties that we see, particularly in Northern Virginia, could be impacted beyond what their sort of level numbers show. The one other thing that I wanted to also point out is that here we have a lot of Northern Virginia, but of course, Norfolk is home to the naval station that has both civilian personnel, which is captured here, as well as military personnel, which is not captured in these numbers. I will also point out that the OPM does not include USPS for anybody that wants to spend more time with this data. The other big piece of this for Virginia is contract dollars. So I started with the Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond in January of 2008, 2 months before Bear Stearns collapse, another interesting time in the economy. And from almost the time I started looking at the contract dollar numbers, Virginia has, as you all know, has been, kind of vying with California. It's like Virginia, California, Texas, and Maryland are the top receivers of contract dollars. Of course, during sequestration in 2013 and 2014, we were looking at those numbers pretty carefully. So that's what you see on the left. It's total millions of dollars in contracts, and then it's also per capita. Because, of course, the Texas and California economies are much larger than Virginia and Maryland, so as a share of economic activity, these contract dollars matter. And then the grants, Another way of federal spending is sort of the grants. There, Virginia is a little bit more in line with other states. If you look at transfers from federal government to state and local governments, Virginia does not rank as high as many other states, like say West Virginia or other states, outside of the Fifth Federal Reserve District. We do have some material written on this on our website, so if anyone has any questions, feel free to ask. And then finally, one of the things that we're tracking are unemployment compensation claims for the federal government, for federal employees. So the blue line is sort of the standard unemployment insurance. The green line is that UCFE, and then the orange line is for service members. So we now have this data through March 15th. This chart is only through March 8th. So UCFE is now, this is for the U.S., is 564. Continuing, which is back down a little bit. Continuing claims are somewhat elevated. We can see that jump in initial claims for UCFE here. I will say that that increase is not completely out of line with an increase that you will often see in the January and February of a presidential administration shift. So it's not anywhere near, say, where it was during, again, sequestration in 2013 and 2014. But I also want to point out that for both of these, for the UI and for the UCFE, you have to become employed through no fault of your own. And for the UCFE, of course, any deferred resignation or paid administrative leave is not going to be captured in these numbers. So this is unemployment insurance for Virginia. Virginia went up in the last week of the data. This is still initial claims. I think we probably need to start looking at continuing claims or presenting continuing claims. Initial claims are a little elevated. They're not crazy. Continuing claims also seem elevated. This is for UI, but again, not super high. On the UCFE, for our states, there have been some spikes, particularly in DC is quite high. If you look at continuing claims, it's close to 800. Maryland is pretty high. Virginia is elevated, but not, relative to its normal, not where DC and Maryland are right now. So big picture, we have seen slowing growth in GDP and employment, but the economy has remained resilient. Inflation is moving towards target, although progress, has flattened somewhat recently. Labor markets in the U.S. and Virginia continue to normalize, but there are risks. There are risks to the outlook for the U.S. and for Virginia. And with that, I am happy to take any questions.
Thank you. You've given us quite a bit of information and food for thought. So are there any questions to Sonia? Delegate Bolivar.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you as always for coming and giving us really great data and information. I had wanted to get your thoughts on a conundrum that I think you had hit on in your remarks, because at some point you had said you were concerned about making sure that wages and increases in wages got down to that 2% or somewhere down to that 2% per year. And at the same time, you had a number of slides that really pointed out the fact that housing costs continue to exceed that and also take, the 30%, not just 30%, but now approaching 50% of income. And so I guess the problem is that in order to reverse that a little bit, you need to get housing prices under that 2%, while at the same time having incomes rise more than that. And so it's almost like putting your foot on the pedal and the brake at the same time. What are the mechanisms to do that? Have I missed kind of the basic point? But is there, what at the federal level and at the state level can we do to get those wages to rise, but housing prices to moderate so that you're getting back into that 30% range or under that 30% range for household income?
So that's the $1 trillion question. I don't know if you say $1 million question anymore, $60,000 question.
Take a couple seconds to think about it.
Just a couple seconds. So I think, and I think this came out in the slides as well. One of the reasons that we've seen, if not the biggest reason that we've seen house prices increase the way that we have, is because of the inventory challenge. Like, we just don't have the supply of the houses or the single family and multifamily at the level that average, the average American can afford. And I think this is something that we've seen in sort of our urban areas and in our rural areas. So one of the things that we have seen as we go out and talk to people is sort of innovation in how do we increase supply at a lower cost. One of the ones that I get the most excited about are productivity improvements, right? So if you look at manufacturing and you look at manufacturing employment, one reason that we've seen manufacturing employment decline in the last 30, 40 years is certainly because of overseas production and trade and supply chains. But a big reason is that improvement in productivity, increase in productivity that we've seen in the manufacturing sector. We have not seen that same sort of productivity increase in the construction sector. So I think finding ways to sort of innovate in the housing space, those are the things that I get the most excited about. On the wage side, that is a good question. So when I talked about sort of wage growth being above the levels that are sort of reasonably consistent with 2% inflation, I was thinking of like the payroll employment release that comes out, right? And if you look at that 151,000 jobs, you can also look at the average hourly earnings increase, and that is still somewhat elevated, indicating that we don't have a really strongly softening labor market yet. But how do you get, and we have had plenty of periods of inflation being at 2% with wage growth happening, right? So those are not, it's not like one necessarily leads to the other. They don't, and in fact, prior to the most recent, I think there were papers written, quite a few prior to say 2020, that actually looked at just that and saw that was not a one-to-one relationship. It is hard for me, I will say, to get my head around how we get back to 2% inflation in the core services area without seeing, wages in core services come back to, it's not 2%, it's more like 3.5%. I think, one of the challenges that we hear, this is kind of a little bit on the side, but one of the challenges that we hear on the ground is and one of the reasons why I think some of those consumer sentiment indexes were low in 2022 and 2023 is that, we can talk all we want about inflation coming back to 2%, which it is, but that's a growth measure. And your grocery bill is not going to go back to where it was in 2021. So I think one of the challenges that households across the country and in Virginia are facing, especially median income households or lower, is how do I buy the groceries that I bought in 2020 or 2019 and afford, housing. So hopefully, as we have seen real wages actually increase, we saw real wages increase for a lot of those earners. So hopefully, if we manage to sort of increase the supply of housing, particularly housing that is, more affordable to the average household, and we keep inflation under control, that's how we get back to the 2% target. That's my answer to that. But my boss might have a different answer to that. It's a complicated question.
Thank you. Going from here, Delegate McClure.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for the presentation. And I also share and appreciate your excitement for innovation. So I just wanted to kind of touch on any specific examples that you have when it comes to innovation. I had a single-stair bill that passed out of the General Assembly last year dealing with innovation in housing. So just want to know about anything that you may have seen across the country that we could potentially use here when it comes to innovation in housing and creating more supply.
Yeah, I would love to get back to you on that. I think we have some on our website now. We've been focusing on the rural areas a little bit more than the urban areas, but we have seen some. I wouldn't want to call any out right now, but I would love to talk more about that.
Senator Hashmi.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you so much for the presentation. And I found your presentation more reassuring, if I could say that, than I had anticipated. One of my concerns is that as we see the significant loss of jobs for our federal employees all across Virginia, but most especially in Northern Virginia, it doesn't seem like your forecast is anticipating that we're actually going to see a migration of individuals, families out of these impacted regions. My concern has been that we are going to see increased migration. We're going to see actually more inventory on the market, whether it's single-family homes or rental properties, and that is going to force us maybe in next few years' time into another kind of a housing bubble where we have more inventory on the market than we do buyers. And should that happen, then would we anticipate that people are actually going to have higher debt on their mortgages than their homes are worth? Is that the potential crash that we could see coming in a few years' time? I would just love to get your thoughts on that. That's my grim scenario forecast that I've been really worried about coming at us here in Virginia.
Yeah, and I mean, like I said, I started in January of 2008, so I understand the concerns about that, particularly in Northern Virginia. So, you know, again, my views, not the views of the Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond or the Federal Reserve System. Based on the presentations that I've heard, the data that I've seen over the years that I've been doing this job, you know, and what we've been looking at recently, I think, you know, though the federal government jobs that are in Northern Virginia tend to be longer tenured, tend to be higher paid. A lot of that is in professional business services. So if we think about not having those jobs anymore, I think that they're absolutely, it's hard to see a world where there's not some sort of a hit to the state. And, you know, if we do see, you know, for the individual or individual household, you know, finding another job is the goal, not necessarily in Northern Virginia. If we see a lot of people looking for work in Northern Virginia, we absolutely might see some of those people moving outside of the state. So it's hard for me to say that that's not a legitimate concern. You know, I've also been listening to the economic development people for long enough, and this is where you want my colleague Renee Haltom, who spends a lot of time traveling the state talking to people, but I have been listening to them long enough to know that we've been trying to diversify, you know, in Northern Virginia, you know, think about it as private sector as well as government. So it's also possible that we will see, we've got this, you know, one of the things that site selectors will say when they talk about going to a place is we need workers, right? So that if there are, maybe there are opportunities, if you've got a well-educated workforce in a place to bring, you know, sort of companies into that location. So I will say that the forecasting right now is incredibly difficult. It's incredibly difficult nationally, I think less because of federal government and more because of sort of the tariffs and some of the other policy uncertainty. The forecasting in DC, Maryland, and Virginia is really difficult because we don't quite know how this is going to play out. Different agencies could be affected in different ways. Like I said, a lot of that was place of work, not necessarily place of residence. So there could be certain counties that are hit in that way. But not, we don't see it necessarily in the whole region. So I don't think it's an illegitimate concern at all. But it's kind of a little bit hard to tell right now how that's gonna play out. And we saw that, right, in Northern Virginia, really. If you were like, when I was speaking to this commission in 2008, 2009, 2010, the place in the district outside of some of the coastal parts of North Carolina and South Carolina, the place that we saw house prices fall the most and we had, you know, more underwater mortgage holders was in Northern Virginia. But I also think that households are in a very different position now than they were. The leverage looks different now. You know, we don't have the same types of mortgages now that we did. So I wouldn't necessarily want to predict something similar to what we saw then.
Is that your question? Thank you. Thank you so much for your presentation.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, we're now down to agenda item number 5, which is an overview of our work plan for 2025 and our interim work groups.
So Molly Bowers is going to hand out to you all our work plan for 2025 interim.
More stuff from you guys.
The topics before you, approved by the chair, either through bills sent to the commission or letters sent by legislators. We have 17 topics, a full spectrum of topics, a lot, but doable. The topics have been divided into 2 work groups. The 2 work groups will be Affordable Housing Solutions, Landlord, Tenant, and Real Estate Law, and that'll be chaired by Delegate Brianna Sewell. And Neighborhood Transitions, Local Land Use, and Community Living, and that will be chaired once again by Delegate David Bulova. Meetings will all take place in person. The Speaker of the House has allowed some exceptions for House members to appear remotely, but they cannot count toward a quorum and cannot vote on issues before the commission. Meetings will be kept to a 2-hour limit or as close as possible. The dates of the full commission meetings are listed on the website at vhc.virginia.gov. Also know, if you're not here in person at today's meeting, all meetings and the work plan will be posted immediately upon this meeting ended. Each full commission meeting will take place at 10 a.m. in Senate Room C, barring technical difficulties. The next full commission meeting will be Tuesday, July 15th, followed by Tuesday, October 7th, and the final full commission meeting will be Thursday, December the 4th. Work groups will meet throughout the interim as needed and will be announced as they are scheduled. The first work groups will be held on May 22nd. The Affordable Housing Solutions Work Group will meet at 10 a.m., followed by the Neighborhood Transitions Work Group at 1 p.m. Work group members will be contacted in the coming weeks. Please let me know by email if you'd like to remain a member of a work group. Thank you so much, people. Look forward to a good year working on good housing solutions.
Any questions or issues with the plan? Okay, we're now down to agenda item number 6, which is public comment, and I believe we have 2 people who've signed up for public comments. Who are they? Who are these people?
Signed up for public comment?
And if you could please limit your comments to 3 minutes.
Hello, everyone. My name's Janice Wolt-Grenadier. I am a certified ADA advocate and mediator. I am sitting on a board right now for the Homeowners Grassroots Coalition, which is a group that is looking throughout the United States at the deed theft that's taken place. And I want to talk to you about it. It's where our homes have been foreclosed on with illegitimate documents. Letitia James in New York, Brad Raffensperger in Georgia, and we look in Tennessee at Graceland, where the homes were taken with forged signatures, with robo-signing, and other crimes. We have it very active here in Virginia. I am a victim of it. I'm still fighting it in the courts. My loan trust was on the documents that were done by Lynn Simoniak, which the state of Virginia got a lot of money out of that. Where'd that money go? It went into a slush fund. It didn't go to the people who've been harmed. Both of these are 2 assignments that are on my home, which show that my house was on LaSalle Bank, Bank of America, and Wells Fargo Bank, all at the same time. The final affidavit that they foreclosed on my home in 2018, which I am still in fighting, the attorney barcode has to be there in Virginia in order for the clerk of court to do it. It belongs to a judge in Florida. It never worked for Aquin. That by itself should be disturbing to everybody, but it's acceptable to the courts and acceptable to our Attorney General. All of the documents on here that were used were all either forged and or robo-signed. I met with some of the people who did it, actually. Went down to Florida. The home was foreclosed on in 2018. In 2019, Wells Fargo Bank, who was apparently foreclosed on it, did a letter notarized stating they had no interest in it and had no documentation having owned it. The lawyers that are coming after me, Tautman Pepper Locke, they have asked me to do a short sale. They have spoken with the lawyers, the judges in ex parte. I also got a letter in 2020 that my mortgage was no longer being serviced by Aquin. It had been moved to New Res. New Res took a loan out on it with one of their mortgage companies for $900,000. Now remember, this is 2 years after. I signed into my account, my mortgage account, and the original loan has never been paid off. Wells Fargo Bank is the one who claims, the lawyers claim who purchased it. Wells Fargo Bank has notarized statements put into the record on their own. They have nothing to do with it.
Excuse
and we
me.
as citizens, yes, ma'am.
Thank you for bringing that forward, but what is it that you would like for this commission to do about the information that you're bringing forward?
I think that this commission is proper in order to look into the deed theft. And if you're concerned about our housing, however our coalition goes with gathering the information on the number of people that had their homes foreclosed in 2008, where the mortgage-backed securities didn't exist, where the state received money for that, there was a big cover-up. And I think a lot of those people need to be made whole or at least compensated in some way. A lot of people were not intelligent enough. I don't want to say they were stupid, but we were naive. We didn't understand the system. We didn't understand what was actually taking place in the back room of the banks. And if you look at the bankers that did all of this, they're now in the head part of the servicers. I can show you the entire system and how it worked and who was there, who was here. In fact, actually, one of the architects, what's his name? Cooperman. He owned 10% of Aquin. He worked for Goldman Sachs, and he has made billions of dollars off of this. And not only that, he has violated the SEC rules by working with the mortgage, with the different servicers in the foreclosures.
Madam Chair.
We have a question for you from Delegate McClure.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair, and I appreciate you bringing this issue forward. I believe that we've passed legislation on this specifically already. Virginia Housing is supposed to study this issue and bring it back to the legislature by November 1st, and it passed unanimously. I believe Simons and Hackworth carried the bill.
Who was that? I'm sorry.
Simons, Delegate Simons, and I believe Marcus Simon. I thought it was Simons. Shelley Simons.
Shelley Simons?
We can double check the specifics, but we did pass this in the House of the Senate. And so they're supposed to study that and bring that back November 1st.
Madam Chair.
So the issue is already being addressed.
Okay, are you all interested in me getting further in touch with them? Or is it something that your board, are you saying your board is the wrong board for it?
We will provide you with, it's being studied, correct? The information, it's being studied.
You will provide that to me?
We can provide you with the legislation.
That would be great.
That's providing the study.
I would greatly appreciate it because I think I have the information that would be very helpful to them.
Is House Bill 2396.
2396.
And Marcus Simon is the chief patron of that bill.
Marcus Simon. Okay. Thank you very much for your time. And if anyone has any questions, please feel free to reach out to me or you know of anyone having these issues.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much. Have a nice day.
And was there a second person?
I believe they didn't stand up, so we won't worry about them.
Okay. Is there anyone else who would like to bring any other issue before the commission at this time? If not, we will stand adjourned.
This is the Senate of Virginia, Richmond, Virginia. Senate Committee Room, A305. Did you know that you can watch the Senate live on YouTube? Visit the channel by browsing to youtube.com/@Senate of Virginia. That's youtube.com/@Senate of Virginia. Senate Committee Room, A305. This is the Senate of Virginia, Richmond, Virginia.